We know that Richard's remains are likely to lie in the remains of the Greyfriars.
By looking at the DNA of living individuals and comparing that.
And we find skeletal remains of somebody that look like it could be him.
After centuries of mystery and rumors, science finally pulled back the curtain on King Richard III. And trust me, the results shook history to its core. Imagine a skeleton dug up from under a car park, suddenly rewriting royal bloodlines. DNA tests didn't just whisper the truth, they screamed it, locking his identity with a mind-blowing 99.999% certainty. But here's the baffling fact. His male lineage didn't even match living relatives. Shocking, right? Stick around, because the twists in this story only get crazier the deeper we go. DNA analysis reveals unexpected break in royal lineage. The discovery that came from the genetic analysis of Richard III's remains left historians and scientists alike in absolute amazement, and perhaps even in disbelief. They said that when researchers carefully compared the Y-chromosome from Richard III's skeleton with the DNA of living male line relatives who, on paper, should have shared the exact same patrilineal DNA, they stumbled upon something that no one quite expected. Instead of a neat confirmation of family ties, they found a puzzling mismatch, a result that challenged centuries of assumptions about how royal succession was traced and passed down. The story was told of how Professor Tudor King, who led the project at the University of Leicester, gathered DNA samples from 5 men living today, each of them direct male line descendants of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort. In theory, these men should have carried the very same Y chromosome as Richard III, since the Y chromosome is passed almost unchanged from father to son. And if history had flowed exactly as the textbooks told us, that simple strand of DNA would have been the final proof that tied a centuries-old king to the bones unearthed beneath a forgotten car park. But what scientists uncovered wasn't just surprising, it was unsettling. It cracked open questions of royal bloodlines, hidden scandals, and whether the man history remembers as Richard III was truly who we believed him to be. This wasn't just science confirming a story, it was science rewriting one. And if you stay with me all the way to the end, you'll see how a single twist of DNA managed to shake the foundations of a dynasty. Yet what happened was nothing short of remarkable. Not a single one of those 5 men matched Richard's DNA. 4 of them, researchers explained, belonged to a common haplogroup known as R1bu152, while Richard's remains revealed something entirely different, the much rarer haplogroup GP287. Could it be, they wondered, that somewhere along the centuries, the story of bloodlines was not as straightforward as it was written in the history books? What scientists called this was a false paternity event, a term that might sound clinical, but it essentially meant that the man listed as a father in the family line was not, in fact, the biological father. How often could such a thing have happened across history? Researchers like King and Jobling pointed out that, according to their studies, false paternity rates in past generations might have ranged anywhere between 1% and 4.5%. And since many historians and geneticists tend to settle on a rate of around 2% per generation, the likelihood of such an event cropping up somewhere in 19 generations, the exact distance between Richard III and the Beaufort descendants, was calculated to be about 16%. In simple terms, it was not just possible, but rather plausible, that a break in the male line might have occurred during those centuries. And to make matters even more interesting, one of the 5 Somerset men tested was found to belong to yet another haplogroup altogether, IM170, which suggested that another false paternity event had happened much more recently, perhaps within just the last 4 generations. Was this not enough to make anyone pause and think about how fragile and unpredictable lineage really is? The ripple effect of this discovery went far beyond the laboratory and into the halls of history. Historians began to ask the very questions people might have avoided for generations. If this genetic break had taken place during the crucial stretch of 5 generations between John of Gaunt and Richard III, Then what did that mean for the English crown?
So the Y chromosome also, very simple pattern of inheritance. It has on it the gene for maleness, so it only goes down through the male line.
After all, if the break happened between Edward III and John of Gaunt, then the legitimacy of the entire Lancaster line came into question. This would not only affect Henry IV, but also his son, Henry V, and his grandson, Henry VI. And if that were not enough, the implications would echo further, indirectly shaking the foundation of the Tudor dynasty as well, since their claim partly relied on descent from John of Gaunt. Imagine the weight of that revelation. Could it be that some of the most famous monarchs in English history might not have had the legal right to rule? It was a tantalizing thought, one that both fascinated and unsettled scholars. Professor Kevin Schurer remarked that while one historical puzzle seemed to have been solved, another had immediately opened, almost like peeling back one layer only to reveal an even deeper mystery. Was this not the very nature of history, to remind us that what we thought was certain might never be quite as secure as we believed? The findings stirred debates not only about monarchy and legitimacy, but also about how we, as people, understand family, inheritance, and identity. Some wondered aloud, if the crown itself could be touched by uncertainty, what about the rest of society, where family records were less meticulously kept? Others reflected on how this discovery humanized royal families, reminding the world that behind the crowns and thrones, they were people too, subject to the same twists of fate, secrets, and unexpected turns as anyone else. And so, the genetic story of Richard III did more than shed light on one king's identity. It forced historians, scientists, and the public to rethink the very idea of lineage, asking once more the question, how much of what we believe about the past is written in stone, and how much is still waiting to be uncovered? So now, the question that once seemed unthinkable is being whispered again, louder than ever. If Richard's line wasn't what it appeared to be, then what about those who came after him? Could the very foundation of the Tudor dynasty, the family that reshaped England forever, rest on shaky ground? Stay with me, because the answer might just rewrite everything we thought we knew about the throne. Could the Tudor claim to the throne be illegitimate? The discovery of Richard III's remains and the DNA results that followed brought with them a revelation that left many people questioning centuries of royal history. When scientists confirmed that Richard's Y-chromosome did not match that of living male line relatives, it set off a wave of curiosity and debate. People began to wonder what this really meant for the royal succession, and for the Tudors in particular. After all, Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and went on to reign as Henry II, always claimed a bloodline link to Edward III. But if the DNA shows a break somewhere in that lineage, does that not cast doubt on his right to the throne? It made people ask themselves, had the entire Tudor dynasty been built on shaky ground? Tracing the royal family tree only made the matter even more intriguing. Both Richard III and Henry Tudor traced their roots back to King Edward III, but they did so through different branches of the family. Henry's claim came through the Beaufort line, which descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's son. This seemed straightforward on paper, yet the DNA results suggested otherwise. If the genetic break happened anywhere between Edward III and John of Gaunt, the legitimacy of the Lancastrian line would be in question. And if John of Gaunt himself was not Edward's son, then the entire claim that led to Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, and eventually Henry VII would be weakened. Was it possible, then, that Henry VII's entire claim rested on something other than blood? That question hung heavy, because Henry's own mother, Margaret Beaufort, was also a descendant of John of Gaunt. If his legitimacy faltered, so did hers, and with it, the very foundation of Tudor authority. The story became even more fascinating when people remembered the rumors that had haunted John of Gaunt during his own lifetime. Whispers followed him about whether he was really Edward III's son at all. The gossip at the time claimed that since Edward III was away when Gaunt was born, Doubts arose about whether Queen Philippa had been faithful. The cruelest rumor of all insisted that Gaunt was actually the son of a Flemish butcher, swapped into the royal cradle after the Queen's newborn daughter supposedly died. John of Gaunt himself had been enraged by these accusations, and yet centuries later, the DNA findings seemed to breathe new life into those same old whispers.
The DNA is telling us that there has been a non-paternity or...
Was it just idle talk meant to hurt his reputation? Or had there been some truth to the stories all along? Looking at Henry II's rise to power, historians have often remarked that his claim to the throne was far from solid, even without the DNA mystery. Many pointed out that he never relied solely on bloodline to justify his position. Instead, he declared that he ruled by right of conquest, which was a bold but telling move. After all, defeating Richard III on the battlefield gave him power, but it did not necessarily give him unquestionable legitimacy. To strengthen his position, Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims. This union created a sense of stability and gave the Tudors a stronger appearance of legitimacy. Yet the question still lingers. If Henry had not won on the battlefield, would his claim alone have ever been enough? Professor Kevin Schurer and other historians often remind us that monarchy is never just about bloodlines. It is about opportunity, timing, and chance, just as much as it is about inheritance. The throne has passed through so many twists, battles, and political maneuvers that pure descent from father to son has rarely been the only deciding factor. Even today, experts agree that the current royal succession is unaffected by these ancient genetic discoveries. After all, centuries of marriages, secret treaties, and brutal power struggles didn't just shape the monarchy into what we recognize today. They carved out an entire legacy that still commands fascination. And here's the twist. A single revelation in modern science, one hidden deep in the strands of DNA, suddenly forces us to question whether history was ever as secure as we thought. When researchers uncovered a genetic truth about Richard III, it wasn't just another footnote buried in dusty archives. It was a discovery that pulled back the curtain on the very foundation of royal dynasties. Imagine the shock, because if the Tudors weren't as entitled to the throne as they claimed, then the history we've been told for centuries might have been written not by rightful heirs, but by the lucky survivors of chaos. And if that's the case, then what else have we misunderstood? Stay with me, because the answer hides in one of the most intimate places possible: mitochondrial DNA, which confirms Richard III's maternal link. Mitochondrial DNA confirms maternal link to Richard III. He explained that while the Y-chromosome testing had given some surprising results about royal lineage, it was the maternal DNA evidence that provided the conclusive proof of Richard III's identity through his female ancestry line. The scientists said that this was the key that finally settled the question once and for all. They spoke about how the match with the descendants of Anne of York stood out as a perfect fit. Unlike the paternal DNA, which can sometimes be less reliable when traced over so many centuries, the maternal DNA, known as mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA, passes directly from mothers to all of their children. Yet, as they reminded everyone, only daughters can pass it on to the next generation. This made it possible to trace an unbroken female line stretching all the way from Richard III's sister, Anne of York, down to two living individuals in the present day, Michael Ibsen and Wendy Doldig. Both of them, although distant cousins, were connected to this long female chain of ancestry. They were described as 14th cousins twice removed, which sounded incredibly distant. And yet, here they were, alive today, both living in London, unknowingly carrying this link to one of the most controversial kings in English history. It was reported that when the DNA analysis was done, the results were astonishing. Michael Ibsen's mitochondrial DNA was found to be a perfect match to the DNA extracted from the skeleton that had been discovered. Wendy Doldig's DNA, on the other hand, showed only a single base difference. The researchers explained that this small variation was not a problem at all, but rather consistent with the number of generations that separated them from Anne of York. After all, in such a long span of time, would it not be normal to see tiny changes? This, they argued, made the evidence even stronger, because it showed that the line had remained essentially intact through all those centuries. The scientists went on to say that mitochondrial DNA holds several advantages when it comes to identifying ancient remains. They pointed out that every single cell in the body contains many copies of mitochondrial DNA, unlike nuclear DNA, which is present in only 2 copies per cell. What does this mean for ancient bones buried for hundreds of years? Simply that mDNA has a higher chance of surviving decomposition and being available for testing centuries later. They also stressed how mitochondrial DNA is remarkably stable through maternal lines. Because it does not undergo recombination like nuclear DNA, changes occur only through rare mutations. This stability makes it one of the most reliable tools for tracing ancestry across long stretches of time. And then there is another factor that the researchers reminded the public about: the idea of false paternity, which has always been a challenge when using Y-chromosome testing. Over history, questions of uncertain fatherhood are far more common than uncertain motherhood. False maternity is exceptionally rare, so when you are trying to prove identity across centuries, which line would you trust more? The answer, they said, was clear. They further explained that this maternal DNA evidence, when combined with all the other discoveries, supported the skeleton's identity with overwhelming certainty. The statistical analysis had produced a probability of 99.999% that the remains were indeed those of Richard III. But that was not all. To make their findings even more convincing, the scientists compared the DNA against 26,127 European DNA sequences. None of them matched, which gave a conservative match probability of about 1 in 10,000. How much stronger could the evidence be? It was said that the researchers themselves were astonished at the clarity of the results.
DNA analysis comparing the genetic code in the bones with that of Michael Ibsen.
Beyond the numbers, they added, there were also the physical and historical details that lined up perfectly. The skeleton showed signs of scoliosis, a condition that was reported in historical accounts of Richard III. The bones carried evidence of battle wounds that matched the circumstances of his violent death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. The estimated age of the man at the time of death also matched Richard III's age when he was killed. Could all of this really be a coincidence? The researchers argued that when one looked at the DNA, the archaeological context, and the historical records side by side, the case was closed beyond reasonable doubt. They described it as one of the most remarkable resolutions of a mystery in history. After all, Richard III had been missing for over 500 years. His reputation had been shaped by Shakespeare's words, by legends, and by political propaganda. But his actual body had vanished from history. People had speculated for centuries about where he was buried and whether his remains could ever be found. And yet, here it was, science stepping in to provide the answers. It made people ask, how often do we really get to see a centuries-old mystery solved in such a definitive way? For the 2 living descendants, Michael Ibsen and Wendy Duldig, the experience must have been surreal. One day, they were ordinary people living in London, and the next, they were being told that their mitochondrial DNA had confirmed the identity of a medieval king. Imagine being told that you carry the same maternal line as one of the most famous kings in English history. Would anyone ever expect that to happen in their own life? They themselves were reportedly astonished, but also humbled by the idea. Their existence, unknowingly, had provided the final piece of a puzzle that historians had debated for centuries. The researchers concluded that this case had shown the power of genetics not only in modern medicine, but also in historical investigations. It reminded people that DNA is not just a scientific code, but also a living story, passed from one generation to the next. They asked, what other mysteries could one day be solved with the same methods? What other figures from history might be identified when science and archaeology work hand in hand? The story of Richard III was not just about proving the identity of a long-dead king. It was also about showing how the past and present are connected in ways that no one could have imagined. By the end of the study, the consensus was clear. The combination of mitochondrial DNA evidence, statistical certainty, and physical matching details had closed a case that had been open for more than 5 centuries. Richard III had finally been found, not through rumor or legend, but through the voices written in his very cells and echoed down the generations to 2 distant cousins in modern London. The discovery left people with a simple truth. Science had given Richard III his name back, and in doing so, it proved something haunting yet beautiful, that history doesn't really disappear. It lingers in silence, waiting for the right hands, the right questions, and the right moment to reveal itself again. But here's where it gets even more fascinating, because beyond just finding Richard's bones, his DNA began to speak. And the story it told wasn't about dusty relics or forgotten kings. It was about a man's life, his struggles, his health, and the legacy he never knew he'd leave behind. So stay with me till the very end, because what Richard III's DNA uncovers will change the way you think about history itself. What Richard III's DNA tells us about his life and legacy. When historians and scientists came together to study the remains of Richard III,
Right, so tonight I'm going to be talking to you about the Richard III case, and I should start by saying it wasn't known as the Richard III Project.
they were not simply confirming the identity of a long-dead king. They were opening a window into the physical reality and lived experience of one of England's most controversial rulers. People had always been told to imagine Richard III through the lens of Shakespeare's play or Tudor-era propaganda. But what did the evidence actually say? The genetic analysis of his remains has turned out to be more than just a scientific footnote. It has become a powerful way of reshaping how the world understands him. It forced people to stop and ask themselves if the man they had been taught to despise really looked and lived the way history books had always claimed. Could it be that his image was more political construction than physical truth? The first and perhaps most striking discovery came from the careful examination of his skeleton. Researchers found that Richard had severe scoliosis that developed after the age of 10. This condition meant that one of his shoulders, most likely the right one, would have been visibly higher than the other. This detail is fascinating because it lined up with some of the descriptions that came from his own time. Yet, what was equally striking was that the scoliosis did not make him frail or incapable. Reports showed that despite his curved spine, his body was still strong and capable of the demanding physical activities required of a warrior king. Could it be possible, then, that the image of him as weak and deformed was an exaggeration, maybe even a carefully crafted story meant to tarnish his legacy? The evidence suggested exactly that. What many people found most revealing was what the bones did not show. There was no trace of a withered arm. There was no sign of the grotesque deformities that Shakespeare described so vividly. Instead, the skeleton painted a very different picture. It told of a man who may have stood out because of his uneven shoulders, but who was otherwise fit and fully able to fight. That simple fact alone seemed to undo centuries of myth-making. It made people wonder why his enemies had gone to such lengths to present him as a twisted figure both inside and out. Was it because the Tudors needed to paint him as monstrous to make their own claim to the throne seem more justified? That thought became difficult to ignore. The genetic analysis went even further, touching not only on his health, but on his very appearance. DNA evidence revealed that Richard III almost certainly had blue eyes. It also showed that as a child, he probably had blonde hair. Over time, of course, that blonde hair may have darkened to a brown shade, as often happens. This finding was particularly interesting when compared with some of the portraits created of him long after his death. In many of those images, he was shown with darker features, more brooding, almost menacing. These artistic choices, historians realized, may not have been an attempt to capture reality at all. Instead, they seem to reflect the Tudor desire to keep his image in line with the story of him as a villain. So, if the DNA evidence suggested he looked quite different from those portraits, what else might have been deliberately altered about his memory? The fact that he may have once been fair-haired as a boy struck many as significant. People began to picture a young Richard, blue-eyed and blonde, perhaps looking very different from the stern-faced man painted centuries later. How strange, then, that the visual memory of him had been so distorted by politics. It made people pause and ask, if art could mislead so easily, how many other figures from history had been made into caricatures instead of remembered as they truly were? Richard's case became a reminder that portraits and plays are often less about the subject and more about the storyteller. But perhaps the most powerful lesson came not from what Richard's bones and DNA revealed individually, but from what they revealed together. The combined picture of his physical reality showed just how easily stories can be twisted for political gain. For centuries, Richard had been described as a crooked, villainous hunchback who clawed his way to the throne through murder and deceit. Yet here was scientific evidence stripping away at least part of that narrative. He did not have the monstrous deformities people were led to believe. He did not look the way hostile portraits had suggested. He was, in short, a victim of a very successful smear campaign. And so, people were forced to wonder how many of the so-called facts about him were truly facts at all. Modern science, through this analysis, became something of a truth-teller for medieval history. It allowed historians to move beyond rumor and bias, grounding their understanding of Richard III in evidence rather than propaganda. It showed how DNA and skeletal analysis could correct centuries of misinformation, and it raised larger questions about how history itself is written. After all, Richard was not the only figure vilified by rivals. What happens when science offers us a clearer, more human picture of people long gone? What does that do to the stories we thought we knew so well? Richard's story, therefore, is not just about one king. It is about the power of narratives and the way they can shape collective memory for hundreds of years. For the Tudors, making Richard appear monstrous was not merely about insulting him. It was a way to strengthen their own claim to power. By showing the last Plantagenet king as evil and malformed, they could present Henry VII as the rightful savior who ended chaos. Shakespeare's play only amplified this version of events, embedding it in popular imagination for centuries. Yet, when his bones were unearthed and studied, this carefully built image began to crumble. Could it be that science, centuries later, has become the most unbiased historian of them all? In truth, Richard III's remains tell a story that is at once deeply personal and deeply political. On the personal level, they reveal the life of a man who endured scoliosis but still fought and ruled. They reveal someone whose appearance was not grotesque but likely striking in ways very different from the old portraits. On the political level, they expose how power can manipulate perception and how easily truth can be buried under lies. When his skeleton was rediscovered, it gave him a voice he had not had in 500 years. That voice told people not to believe everything written in chronicles or staged on theater boards. Instead, it reminded them that behind every legend, there is a human being. So, the discovery of Richard II's remains was not merely about identifying a king. It was about rewriting history with evidence rather than opinion. It was about peeling back layers of propaganda to reveal a more complex and human figure. People began to understand that the so-called Hunchback King might not have been the villain they were told to fear, but rather a man caught in the storm of political rivalry. His story has since become a symbol of how science can challenge and even overturn long-accepted truths. And isn't that what makes history so compelling? That it is never truly finished? That with each new discovery, our understanding can shift? In the end, Richard III's remains offered a chance not only to meet him as he really was, but also to reflect on the ways power and politics shape memory. It was almost as if the king himself, long after his death, had been given a chance to speak again, to show his face without the distortions of propaganda. And for many, that revelation was more extraordinary than anything they could have imagined. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.